This lecture will be going over visualization as analyses. Basically, how looking at your data before you run any statistical analyses can reveal structure and patterns that are necessary for gaining a deeper intuition of the relations you're trying to understand. This lecture will be premised in part off of readings by Cairo, the book The Functional Art: An Introduction to Information Graphics and Visualization, specifically chapters 1 and 3, and Yanné and Lurcher, A Hypothesis is a Liability, published in Genome Biology. If you have not done these readings yet, please pause, go do these readings, and come back. The two broad topics of this lecture are the fundamental goals of visualization, data visualization in particular, and balancing a paradox, how data visualization requires balancing competing demands. Let's start by thinking about the goals of visualization. Now, visualization is often thought in data science and applied science as being an afterthought. Once you have a statistical result, what does it look like? However, that's the wrong way to think of it. Visualization should be your first pass in understanding your data. If you have constructed a testable hypothesis based off of a structured theory, you should know a priori what types of ways you should be looking at your data in order to reveal patterns that reflect the relationship of interest. You have a particular set of X, you have a particular Y, you have a particular hypothesis of how they should be related. So the first thing you should do is visualize your data. Take a look at your data first. This helps in a host of different ways. For example, in the reading by Yanné and Lurcher, they presented the results of a very interesting experiment where they presented participants with a data table that had number of steps per day by each participant, their BMI, and their gender. So the data tables look something like this. And the authors had two groups of participants. In one group, they asked participants to just understand the relationships in the data. Just explore the relationship between steps and BMI. In the other group, which is known as the hypothesis group, they were specifically asked whether or not the relationship between steps per day and BMI was moderated or depended on gender. So they were giving a very specific hypothesis to evaluate. Now, looking at these numbers on this data table doesn't reveal much of a pattern. It's very hard for the human visual system to scan columns of numbers and understand relations between them. However, if students just simply plotted this data, they would discover an interesting pattern in the data. In this case, a gorilla waving at them. So if you simply plot the values from these data tables, you would see that there's this trick in the data. There's an interesting pattern that reveals structure. Now, of the group that was hypothesis focused, that was responsible for just testing a very specific hypothesis, 14 out of 19 participants did not discover the gorilla. Whereas in the hypothesis-free condition, 9 out of 14 participants discovered the gorilla. So this is a good illustration of how visualization reveals structure in your data. As you get into different types of statistical tools, often they come with certain types of assumptions about the nature of your data, its distributions, a priori correlations between data sets. And each one of those assumptions can be violated if you don't run specific tests or understand the nature of your data itself. And visualization leverages the human visual system's astute pattern recognition abilities in order to discern meaningful relations in your data. I would not be able to accurately describe the shape of this gorilla, with a function. I mean, I probably could, but I wouldn't have a deep intuition of how that shape should look without knowing it was there. But as soon as I plot the data, I see the gorilla. I see the pattern that's nested in the data. And my human visual system can give me that structure automatically. So data visualization is the art of allowing the perceptual expertise of the human visual system to work in your favor, to understand in a deeper way the relationships in your data. Now, data visualization itself sounds relatively trivial, but it turns out it's a very complicated idea. Classically, Tufte proposed the idea of graphical excellence. Graphical excellence, in the terms of data visualization, is the goal of having an efficient communication of complex quantitative ideas. So in this case, you should have your graphics reveal data in a meaningful and intuitive way. It's not just showing scatter plots between variables. It's not just showing bar plots with error bars. You need to reveal the meaning visually. And Tufte proposed 9 properties of graphical excellence. First, simply show the data. If you have a particular set of x's and a particular set of y's, show the data. Scatter plots, distributions, however. Substance should be prioritized over method. And what that means is present information, not just pretty pictures. As we'll go over later in this lecture, there are many ways that you could add visually catchy things to your graphic in order to pull people's attention in, but you don't want to do that too much. You want to hold close to the information underlying your data. Next, you want to avoid distortion. So you want to be honest about the nature of your data itself. Don't transform, don't try to not squish axes relative to other axes. Try to be true to the actual underlying form of the data itself. A good graphic or graphical excellence should present many numbers in a small space. You want to have the ability to kind of compress information into a meaningful space, or be at least efficient with the use of visual space. You should have the ability to express coherent large data sets. So a good graphic doesn't drown the viewer in data. If there's a trend that can be compressed into a meaningful line without throwing away meaningful information, do it. Abstract away. We'll go over this in a little bit more detail in the second part of this lecture. A good graphic, or achieving graphical excellence, should also encourage visual comparisons. So contrasts are very valuable tools for people to understand structure in their data. Comparing across groups or comparing across geographical locations, those comparisons give anchoring points for understanding differences. Present many levels in detail. So what you want is you want to go from broad to fine as much as possible. You want your graphic to show the high level, broad general concepts as well as the minutiae of relations between individual observations themselves. A good graphic or data visualization should have a clear purpose. There's nothing more annoying than looking at a graph and not understanding what it is you're supposed to see. So this purpose should be descriptive. It should have the purpose of exploring relationships or tabulating relationships. In some cases, it could just be purely decorative. It could just be eye-catching, although for scientific visualizations, you don't really want those decorative types of approaches. And finally, your data visualization or graphical excellence in your data visualization should be integrated with the statistics themselves. So if you're going to report a statistical result in your text, the graphic that's associated with it should have an integration with that test. If you're, for example, if you're talking about group differences, having a plot that shows group differences, like a bar plot, is integrated with statistics. If you're showing a correlation, showing a scatter plot, is a way of showing or illustrating that statistical test. So these are Tufte's 9 properties of graphical excellence. And this will kind of serve as an anchor as we dig deeper into the nature of building a good data visualization tool or data visualization graphic. But the purpose of these 9 properties is really to facilitate the encoding of complex information. So in the first chapter of the Cairo book, or Cairo book, I apologize, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that name correctly. He goes over the pathway from visualization to what he calls wisdom. So there is information, which is stuff in the world. There's knowledge, which is an understanding of relations. And then there's wisdom, which is a deeper understanding of the patterns in your data. And every graphic visualization should follow along this continuum. First, you start with some unstructured information in the outer world, something you're trying to represent. Brain activity under a given task, socioeconomic status, cognitive dissonance. And what you do is you gather and filter first level encoding of that unstructured information into data. This was the focus of the lectures on theory and hypothesis generation. So the idea is that you gather and you identify mappings of this unstructured information to data tables. Now, the visualization part involves a second level of encoding. So you're communicating to an audience, and often this audience is yourself, a representation of that data in a structured way. And this is the visualization itself. So you're encoding a relationship between an X and a Y by visualizing, let's say, a scatter plot that shows the structure of that relationship. Now, the audience, which is often you, but when you publish a paper or present a talk, is going to be the people who are reading or seeing your results, need to decode that information. They need to be able to take what you've encoded in your first level and present it as a structured visualization and extract out knowledge of those unstructured information. So audiences essentially act as a decoding of the structured information you put in your data visualization. And if your graphic is good and you've communicated your results in an effective way, after knowledge will come wisdom. As your audience takes the time to digest and really understand the relationships you're visualizing, they'll gain a deeper understanding of those unstructured information. Really good data graphics will allow for readers to continually exploring the visual information you're presenting and dig out new things. So the first level pass, they'll gain a little bit of knowledge. As they continue exploring that graphic, they'll gain a deeper and deeper wisdom of the fundamental structures of the information you've encoded. This is the fundamental goal of data visualization. Now, doing this sounds laudable as a goal, but the execution is tricky. And that is the part of the main focus of the third chapter in the Cairo book. As a data visualizer, you need to think carefully about that decoding process, how your audience views the visualization you present to them. So you can think about this as a continuum between a designer, you, and a reader, which can also be you, but is often your audience you're trying to communicate to in a paper or a talk. So you have some data that is encoded in some visual textual way. Plot with words and numbers and visual graphics of some sort. And that gets passed along to the reader. And the reader decodes that information without necessarily discussing or having a communicative dynamic with the designer themselves. And in that decoding process, they gain a degree of understanding. So you want to be able to target how to design this process so that there is this efficiency in how you transmit your visual textual encoding of your data to your reader so that the understanding just naturally pops out. So the encoding process itself is adapted to the nature of the information you're trying to convey. So how this visual textual coding relates to or facilitates decoding depends a lot on the nature of the information you're trying to present. Now, when you're talking about scientific literature, often that is pre-specified by the variables you're looking at. So it's a lot easier when you're talking about the context of a scientific study as opposed to, let's say, a journalism article about spending on prison populations. But how you present that information, that data, in an encoded way will really need to adapt to what information you're presenting. Are you talking about groups? How you present information about groups is going to be different than how you present something about time. In addition, there's going to be a relationship between this visual textual encoding process and the dynamic of moving from decoding to understanding. Your encoding or your visualization should garner intuitions about the knowledge of the user on the subject matter itself. So you can assume some degree of prior knowledge on the reader, but how much you assume depends on the audience you're communicating. If you're writing a popular press article on, let's say, the relationship between sleep and working memory, you're going to have to assume not a lot of information. You're going to have to assume that the reader doesn't have a lot of information. However, if you are writing it to an audience at the journal Sleep and Memory, your visualization can be stripped down a lot more because you can assume a lot of prior knowledge. And that prior knowledge about the topic will facilitate this transition from decoding to understanding in their mind, right? So if you are correct in assuming the right priors of information that your reader has, you can rely to more or less degree on that prior knowledge to shift this decoding to understanding. But if you're wrong, it impairs that process. Readers will be able to decode relationships, but they won't gain a deeper understanding or a deeper level wisdom, if you will, from the information you're conveying. Now, Cairo said that this process from data to understanding in terms of graphical visualization amounts to a struggle between competing goals along multiple dimensions. So you can think of things as a continuum between information being more complex and requiring deeper, more effortful analyses, or visual information being presented in a shallow but easily intelligible way. And there's a struggle there that's going to depend largely on your audience. So Cairo proposed the visualization wheel as a way of thinking about the dimensions that you're trying to balance between complexity and depth and intelligibility and shallowness. And the idea is that any individual data graphic is balancing these competing tensions along these different dimensions. So I'm going to go through a series of examples on each one of these dimensions using data from the psychological or neuroscience literature. So first, there's the balance between abstraction and figuration. The more distant the representation and its referent, the more abstract the visualization. What do we mean by that? Well, the left image here is more figurative. It's showing orientation distribution functions reconstructed along one slice of white matter that's related directly to measures of white matter intensity in the corpus callosum. So right away, you see the corpus callosum in the background. You can see geometric objects aligned in the dimensions or in the directions of white matter. Now, it's not perfectly figurative. It's not just an image of white matter. There is information being presented there. But you know what space you're looking at information is. You know you're looking about something in the brain on the corpus callosum. In contrast, on the right is an abstract representation of the same thing. Basically what this does is it takes the peak of every one of those little blobs that you see in the figure in the right for all parts of the brain and just measures its length. And then you align it up into a 500,000 long vector. And that vector has these squiggles as you go across different fibers in the brain. Now that's a much more abstract. All you see these squiggles, and just looking at that visualization itself doesn't give you any information about the data, where the data comes from. I know where the data is coming from and what it's talking about on the left. It's more abstract on the right. But that abstraction gives me a little bit of value because I can compress lots of information. What you're looking at is a summary of all the white matter in a single person's brain presented as a one-dimensional line. So there's a lot of information in that abstraction that is difficult to do in the more figurative sense. So a good graphic has to balance between being more abstract or being more figurative. In science, most of our graphics are on the abstracted side, but it helps to try to think about how to be a little bit more on the figurative side when you're presenting your information. Next, there's the distinction between functionality and decoration. The inclusion of visual elements to grab attention, but are not directly relevant to enhancing comprehension, are decorative. We don't do a lot of decorative things in science. This is more common in journalism. So a purely functional graphic is like a bar plot, as you see on the top. Here we're just showing mean ratings from different groups. In this case, different groups of rating the reliability of subject information in a control condition, just looking at a bar graph, or looking at a bar graph with the brain image. On the bottom is the bar graph with the brain image itself. This is more decorative. The brain images on the right have no real association with the bar graphs on the left. They're, for this case, just presented there as a decorative feature. And people rate the results as being more reliable if that brain image is present. In fact, that's what the graph on the top is showing you. This is from a paper by McCabe and Castle that showed that there's this implicit bias that people have from just seeing brain images. It makes results seem more truthy. And that illustrates, I think, quite nicely the point that Cairo is trying to make here, where the addition of that decorative information puts in an added level of trustworthiness on the results. So it adds to the understanding in this case, biased way, purely by adding a decorative element. Next, there's a balance between density and lightness. The greater the density of visual information, the more complex the demands to decode that information. So for example, the plot here in the middle is a variant of a classic diagram of the macaque visual system, going from the retina all the way up to high-level visual areas. And it looks like a very complex subway map with lots of dense connections. So if I want to understand relations, I have to take a lot of time to follow individual lines. I have to understand the unique pairing of different brain areas one by one, and it'll take me a lot of time to go through that. It's a very dense graph. The image on the right is a light version of the same type of information, right? So here I'm only showing or only seeing 5 different nodes and the directional relationships between them. It's a much easier graph. It's a lighter, less dense information about connectivity compared to the graph on the left. Now, the graph on the left actually gives me a lot more information. You can print it on your wall and go back to it like any other map. But you can't garner, or you can't get the superficial information about relationships on your first pass. It's less intuitive on that first pass compared to the graph on the right. There's also a tension between dimensionality. So multidimensional data, where you have more layers of depth, result in greater range of ways to decode the information, but at substantial effort. So for example, the graphic on the top which is showing relative risk of a particular disease distributed across regions. I believe this is in Brazil, but I'm not entirely sure. But there's lots of dimensions to the data. There's the risk factors, which are shown in the color bars. There's the geographical location, the different locations on the map. And then there's the two different maps, which are meant to be contrastive. So there are multiple dimensions here. There's geographical location, risk, and then the comparison across panels A and B. It takes a lot of time and effort to understand and discern the patterns in multidimensional features. Whereas unidimensional features, like what you saw in the bottom, all we're looking at is probability distributions of income. So here it's a one-dimensional graph, and it just shows me that pretty clearly that in the census and this particular study sample, both distributions are in the or have incomes that peak roughly in about the $30,000 to $40,000 a year range. I can get that information quickly with ease because I'm only looking along a single dimension. The next point of tension is originality versus familiarity. More familiar plotting styles decrease the effort to encode information and actually decode the information as the observer, but they constrain the ways of presenting the relationships. So for example, a familiar way of plotting group or condition differences is a bar graph, which you see on the bottom. Mostly in science, people are familiar with bar graphs. They know that those error bars likely reflect standard error of the means or standard deviations or confidence intervals, and that the height of the bar reflects the mean. There's that strong prior knowledge that allows for somebody to quickly look and see that, yes, there are strong group differences between this low confidence, high confidence, low volatility, high volatility conditions. Whereas the graph on the top actually presents the same data as the graph on the bottom, at least just for the low and high conflict conditions, not confidence conditions. But it has an additional feature. So it shows every subject as a single point. So you can see the actual distribution. So you don't see the mean, you don't see the variance. You see the distributions of the low and high conditions. And on the right, there is the distribution of the difference effect. Because every subject is observed here, what you're seeing on the right is the distribution with a mean and confidence intervals of the difference between conditions. So this is a complex graph. It's not so complex as it requires lots of minutes of staring, but it shows the way to compare across groups or conditions in a very interesting, novel way. And it takes a little bit of time to understand that, yes, that distribution on the right is showing me the average difference effect. And the fact that it's significant from 0 tells me something. And the plots on the left are showing me every individual subject. So I can get a sense of the distribution, but I don't exactly know what the means and variances are. I can approximate them visually, but I can't really quite see them yet. So this way of looking at your data gives you lots more information, and it gives me an original way of presenting differences as well as group or condition effects. But it takes a little bit of time to both think about how to present the information, and as the observer or the reader, it takes me a little bit of extra time to decode that information because I'm not familiar with it. Finally, there's a tension between novelty and redundancy. What we mean by that is that explaining many different things at once, novelty, provides breadth, while explaining the same thing in different ways, redundancies, provides depth. So the plot on the top shows basically how two estimates of value for rightward and leftward conditions, which we call Q, change as a function of the relative weights between two pathways, a D pathway and an I pathway, and time. So value, Q, is on the y-axis, the relative ratio of weights is on the x-axis, and time is presented as a color. So this is a novel way of showing how the system converges into two different value estimates for left and right actions with time. And you can see essentially the movement of those value differences with time. But it's a novel way of presenting temporal information in this way. So it takes a little bit of time for you to really kind of get a sense of the relations. And with that, this novel way of presenting the information gives me a lot of understanding about the dynamics of the process I'm trying to explain. But it's lots of things. I have value, I have that weight ratio, I have time, and I have the pattern of the changes across time in the two different directions here, left and right. Contrast that with the rain cloud plots shown at the bottom. What you see is a kernel density estimate of the distribution for group 1 and group 2. The whisker plot, which shows the range and confidence intervals in the median, and all observations that go into those distributions and whisker plots for the two groups. So a rain cloud plot is all showing the same information. Everything in blue and everything in red in this plot is the same data, just plotted different ways. But immediately I get a deep level understanding of the distributions. I can see the skew in group 1, and I can see how it's skewed quite effectively. I can see the nice symmetrical distribution in group 2, and I can see where it's not perfect, right? I'm getting a lot of information on a single data point or a single dimension of a variable, as opposed to lots of information about multiple variables like we see at the top. So you can now gain a deeper level understanding about how every graphic you present visually showing your data balances this tension between depth and complexity and shallowness and intelligibility, right? And you don't sit on one place. You could think about these as sitting with some degree of density between, let's say, abstraction and figuration, or density and lightness. And different audiences will expect that you sit on different parts of the spectrum. So for example, in science and engineering, where you can assume a lot of prior knowledge on your readers, and the goal is to convey as much information as possible because you want people to sit and digest these images, you're going to sit more here, higher up in this kind of complexity and depth range. Whereas if you're presenting work for a broad audience, or you're presenting things for audiences with no prior knowledge, like you will in art and journalism, you might sit more down on this range. So you might rely more on lightness and decoration and figuration, as opposed to, let's say, abstraction, functionality, and density, as you would in science and engineering. Now, every graphic that you present to try to show your information and reveal patterns in your information needs to sit somewhere here. And it helps to really think about where your graphics or where your visualizations of your data sit in these dimensions. And one way to think about this process is by trying to ask yourself if the reader can comprehend immediately your primary goal of a graphic. The reader should, after looking at your graphic just once, immediately be able to answer the following questions. 1. What is the figure's central topic? Can the reader tell you what the goal of the graphic is? They should be able to answer what phenomena and variables does the graphic show. Very quickly, they should be able to say what's the context and what are the variables that are being presented. Is it risk of a particular disease across socioeconomic class? Is it distributions of activity across the brain? Is it group differences in working memory load? They should very quickly, very easily be able to answer what variable and what associations or phenomena you're looking at. They should be able to answer what changes does the graphic highlight in the data it represents. So they should be able to say, is there a group difference? Yes or no. Is the data skewed? Yes or no. Does this pattern change across time? Yes or no. Are there differences between brain areas in this one particular effect? Yes or no. Finally, they should be able to answer the question, does the graphic present information in an objective manner, or does the author editorialize about the content? Forgive that typo there. Very quickly, the reader should know, am I looking at something that is presenting information in a comprehensive way, in an objective manner, or is the author basically trying to make an editorialized point? Are they trying to make or amplify some effect in order to make a point? And different graphics will have different goals. In science, we try to be more towards the objective manner. If you're trying to make a case towards public policy, you might want to have a visualization that editorializes, that really amplifies an effect for the viewer. But if the viewer doesn't know what your goal is, if they don't know what your variables are and the associations are that you're trying to show, they don't know how the data presents that, or they don't even know if it's objective or highlighting something to kind of make a point, you've failed in the art of data visualization. And you should always be thinking carefully about how you're presenting this visual information, how you're presenting the associations, how you're parsing your individual associations to tell a story, and how you're tying them together visually. Because as powerful as our statistical tools are, they are still no match for the pattern recognition and intuitive understanding that the human visual system has. So you want to leverage that as much as possible. Tell the key points in your story for your research visually and complement that with your statistics. Doing visualization first tells you essentially what are the proper statistics to reveal the relationship that I see. Is there a linear or nonlinear relationship in your data? Does your data look like it comes from two groups, or it's continuously, it's from one group? Like, do you have clusters or not? All these things pop out when you visualize your data. So you should start every project the first time you go in and you've cleaned your data tables and you've organized them effectively. Before you sit down and do your statistics, visualize your key associations and visualize them cleanly for yourself so that you have this comprehension, you have this understanding. So I hope this lecture has made clear that visualization is your first and most effective tool for understanding and communicating relations in your data. Start with visualization and think carefully about your goals. Effective visual communication of relations in your data requires balancing multiple competing constraints. And there's no right answer for good data visualization in terms of how they're balanced. You should just think about leaning towards more depth and complexity, or more shallow and easily interpretable ranges. But that balance is really going to depend on your goals and the audience you're communicating with, and there will be no right answer. But at least understanding that goes a long ways towards constraining the way that you present your data in a visual format.